how do we get people's attention with great content?
That's the $1 million question. Outside of hiring Ryan Reynolds or some other major celebrity,
So in other words, Stacker is doing the editorial work for
we
them,
are doing the curation, we are doing the quality vetting. A large swath of consumers care less about who's producing this and more about what's the quality of the content.
Noah Greenberg, CEO of Stacker, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right. What inspired Stacker? Tell me about the journey. How has the company evolved over the time?
I guess to take a step back, what Stacker is, we are the first platform for building an earned syndication network. So essentially, we help brands that are increasingly investing in editorial push that out as earned organic media to thousands of news outlets across the country. How I got into that, before founding Stacker, worked at another startup. Had a lot of experience working with newsrooms and kind of selling content products into newsrooms, and just saw about 7 or 8 years ago that news outlets across the country have an increasing appetite for third-party content that they can incorporate into their coverage. News outlets have obviously been relying on things like AP or Reuters for close to a century. But increasingly, I think we're finding that they're looking not just for breaking news or for financial content, but for features, data journalism, service journalism, just more content they can really complement their own original reporting with to keep the site robust. And at the same time, we noticed this big trend in brands hiring journalists and investing in producing really quality coverage, and saw an opportunity to connect those two parties. And that's really what Stacker has done and is all about.
So essentially, is Stacker a newswire for branded content?
So we are a newswire for content produced by brands. I think, historically, content marketing has obviously seen a lot of iterations over the past 10 or 15 years. And I think typically when you think of branded content, you think of a brand approaching a publication and paying them to produce content about the brand or kind of associated with the brand. And I think that the nuance that we've seen over the past 5 years is that as opposed to a brand going and approaching a publication and saying, hey, can we pay you to write a story about us or write a story and kind of include us, we're seeing that brands are actually going out and hiring really seasoned journalists and putting out content that's a little bit less about self-promotional, look how great we are, look at, the trends that we're riding, and more really trying to become an authority in the space and putting out real independent and objective coverage. And so what we consider brand publishing or corporate journalism is the type of content that, yes, we are aggregating from hundreds of organizations and providing in the form of a newswire to publications across the country.
So sounds good, but a lot of people are going to push back and say, hey, wait a second, this is just native advertising. And there's a real, crisis right now in journalism where a lot of people don't trust the news media. So I'm going to throw this question at you. What would you say to those folks who say, hey, you're essentially writing, you're replacing journalists with brands? It's kind of a dangerous thing, isn't it, for journalism?
So I'd push back on, are we replacing journalism with brands? The reality is when someone goes to, let's say someone lives in Miami and they go to the Miami Herald, all that the Miami Herald has is an amalgamation of content produced by brands kind of at the national level, features and evergreen stories. People are not going to continue to come to the Miami Herald. What people are coming there for is local journalism. But I think that what a site like the Miami Herald has found is once they get someone there for that original piece of reporting, they need more content to break down paywalls, keep people subscribed, get an additional few page views out of a given reader. And so we're actually finding that as opposed to being competitive, it's a really nice complement. So what we're finding is a lot of news outlets are, they need to put out and publish a certain amount of coverage every day. And by leaning on third-party sources, they can actually spend more time on original reporting, which is what people are coming to the site for.
Now, Noah, you create a lot of awesome content on LinkedIn, and I was really impressed by everything, your thought leadership about the journalists, the actual journalists, and how they fit into this content creation space. I teach public relations. Are journalists, these new journalists who are working with brands, are they going to replace traditional PR practitioners?
I don't think that journalists joining brands will replace traditional PR. I think that if anything, it gives an even bigger opportunity for PR professionals because there's just more meat for them to go get coverage about, right? So again, I think if you look back 10 years, a brand would put out a press release. It was some bullets of, here's what happened, and it was up to the PR team or PR agencies to go get coverage for that. Now you have brands hiring journalists going through their own proprietary kind of first party data that they have and telling really interesting stories, which is just more fodder for those PR professionals to go get earned coverage for the brand. And so I think it potentially expands the opportunity. It definitely shifts the focus and where people should and should not be spending their time. But I would push back on, is it going to be competitive? Maybe just changes where the time should be spent.
Or redefining how earned is earned, right?
Yeah. Definitely. I think, that's one of the really interesting conversations we've had with the 100 or so brands that are syndicating now through Stacker, is it really has changed how they think about earned. I think traditionally you've said, we really want to get that one or two publications to talk about us and write about our survey, our results, our findings. And in contrast, what we're seeing now is actually if you write the story yourself and you adhere to kind of rigorous journalistic standards and you're not making the story about you, you're making it about the story, about the findings, that there's an opportunity to actually have publications just republish that story in full, but not because they're paid to, because it's a really interesting story.
So can you take us through how the sausage is made? Like take me from client to publication.
For sure. Let's take an organization like Instacart. Instacart has a lot of really interesting data on shopping trends. Instacart typically, from a PR perspective, might put out a press release about here were the top groceries that people bought, over Halloween or over the holidays, and reach out to a bunch of journalists. Hey, would you like to write about, this coverage, right? Maybe you would get a few news outlets to cover that report. How does Stacker work? How are we doing things a bit differently? So first is, again, I think one of the things we're seeing is that brands are actually hiring journalists. So Instacart, as opposed to putting out just a press release, they're writing a full story on here were the top groceries in every state. Another client, maybe it's Experian, has a chief economist. Experian is putting out coverage on here's how credit scores changed last month and how that's impacting the economy, right? They're publishing that story. They're then pushing that story to Stacker, where we have a team of editors that are reviewing each piece of content for a set of editorial standards. They're making sure, is this piece fact-checked? Is it citing sources? Is it self-promotional content about the brand, or is it actual interesting news with that data? If the story meets those standards, it's then being pushed into that newswire along with hundreds of other stories from a bunch of disparate organizations that are doing the same thing, hiring journalists, putting out coverage. And all of that content is aggregated together and presented in the form of a newswire, the Stacker newswire, to thousands of news outlets across the country. So we've gone out and partnered and struck kind of licensing agreements with McClatchy newspapers, Hearst newspapers, Tribune Publishing, AOL, Yahoo, MSN, and thousands of other news outlets who are looking for interesting content, but they're getting 100 PR pitches a day and don't have the time to sift through those and figure out which of these are actual interesting stories and which of them are self-promotional puff pieces. And by working with Stacker, they get an RSS feed right into their CMS of really interesting coverage that they can just republish on their site and trust that it meets that set of standards.
So in other words, Stacker is doing the editorial work for
We
them.
are doing the curation, we are doing the quality vetting, and then we are handling kind of the infrastructure to distribute that content. So because we're plugging RSS feeds right into their CMS, they no longer have to copy and paste images and text and reformat it. We're pumping it right into their system, similar to what a lot of organizations have with like an Associated Press feed.
Yeah, man. So I see that this is the latest trend in journalism. Somewhere there's a journalism professor pulling his hair out, thinking about this, but maybe this is just the future. Speaking of future, can we talk a little bit about AI? And I'm kind of curious how AI is going to impact how Stacker is going to create content, distribute content, and think about content. What are you thinking about AI and later on agentic AI, maybe agents? Bots will do some of the work instead of the journalists.
Yeah. When it comes to Gen AI content, I actually think that brands investing in journalism, brands investing in original editorial will be one of the last areas impacted by this. Why is that? When you think about what AI does, it decreases the cost of producing content and it slightly decreases the uniqueness and the voice of content, right? So AI makes it really easy to publish 10,000 stories instead of just one story, but it makes it much harder to make those stories have a unique voice, a unique angle, and really kind of an authority that you want associated with your brand. And so I think, what we're seeing is the places that have already started to incorporate Gen AI into their content creation and started to get a lot of flack for a lot of the mistakes in it are places where they need to produce tons of content and reduce the price of content so that they can back out on how much money are we making, are we ROI positive on every individual piece of content, right? So you saw places like CNET get in trouble for producing thousands of pieces of content with bots, and there were a lot of errors. And the reason that organizations like that are doing that is because they need to be ROI positive on each individual piece of content they're producing. In contrast, when brands are investing in editorial, they're not thinking about, I'm putting out one piece of content, it costs me this much, and I need to make more than that much money. They're thinking about, how does this piece of content over the long term increase our authority, increase our exposure and mind share with consumers? And they're just willing to invest a bit more and think about the longer term ROI of content. And they're also very concerned with, is this a piece of content that I want associated with us, that has the right voice, the right message, the right tone? And so I actually don't see Gen AI taking a ton of journalism jobs in the brand publishing space. If anything, I think that's an area where we're seeing a lot of editorial jobs being opened and new roles being created. With that said, how do I see agents playing into this? When it comes to Stacker, we do not think of ourselves as an AI company. We're definitely starting to play around with how can we assist that editing and vetting process rather with AI. So we will always need a human editor to review and approve content to make sure that it meets standards. But are there ways to help with, using AI and LLMs to say, hey, this piece doesn't have cited sources. A human may want to give an extra eye on this piece. Definitely. And that's some of the stuff that we're playing around with.
Interesting. So quality control. I like that. All right. Noah, I want to get your thoughts on this. 30 years ago, there was a famous advertising book called Advertising is Dead. I forgot the author. And advertising has still been around. But these days, unless it's a Super Bowl, people hate advertising. Nobody, paid media is for those who have nothing interesting to say. As soon as any of us see an ad, we're waiting for that skip button right away. So when you think about the future of this space, the paid space between influencers and native advertising branded content, is this the future of the industry? What do you think?
I do think native and leveraging creators, influencers, whatever you want to call them, are two trends to watch and two things to bet on over the next 10 years. When it comes to native, this is what we're seeing is consumers don't care if a piece of content is produced by a brand or produced by legacy, more traditional media. What they care is, do I enjoy this content? Is it informative? Is it engaging? Is it entertaining? Whatever you're going for, right? People don't care that this really interesting extreme sports video is made by Red Bull instead of by ESPN. And when they're reading an interesting story about economic projections for this year, we found that they don't care if it's coming from Experian or Freddie Mac versus the Wall Street Journal. Are there the upper, is there 10% of consumers that definitely care? Yes. But I think we've seen that a large swath of consumers care less about who's producing this and more about what's the quality of the content? And I think that that opens up a huge opportunity for native. I think the problem, and one of the problems we're solving, is how does native get distributed, right? Folks are not really going to websites anymore. Very few people are kind of going to even the New York Times website every day. You need to find more distributed ways to reach readers. And similarly, I think brands that are investing in native are realizing no one's going to come to our blog, and we need to think about how do we reach readers with our native content, whether that be through social, whether that be through other syndication methods, et cetera. The second piece of your question on influencers and creatives, or creators rather, is another massive trend. I mean, I think what we saw with the election, what we're seeing with just how the younger generations are consuming content really speaks to the opportunity there. The amount of, anchors that are telling the news on YouTube, on TikTok, the amount of Substackers that are becoming kind of the news source of record for a lot of consumers in their media diet just really speaks to that is an area that has a lot of influence that marketers are going to need to tap into.
Wow. And everything you're talking about is so backed up by academic research. We did a bunch of pieces and we asked people in experiments how they view content that is either created by journalists or by brands. And what we found is, especially amongst younger people, they don't care about the source. What they care about is their utility and relevance. Like, is this making my life better or not? On the other side, Noah, I got to shout out as an old school guy, and excuse me for doing this. There's a real problem when journalism is taken over by the brands, or at least a lot of people would say this may erode, maybe it doesn't matter when it comes to makeup or, the movies, but what about, when it comes to elections, pharmaceuticals, insurance? This is a big question. You don't have to answer it. I'm just throwing this out.
No, I mean, you bring up a great point. Fortunately, I don't think we're seeing brands cover the election. For better or worse, they're avoiding political topics like that. But you're right in that in a world where we're only getting coverage and news and information from brands, there are going to be gaps. I think, the example that really hammers this home for me is you have organizations like Zillow and Redfin in the real estate market that are putting out really interesting coverage, right? They have lots of data. They can do really interesting economic predictions. They can do really interesting backward looks at the data. And there is objectively really interesting coverage about the real estate market coming out of organizations like Zillow and Redfin that have hired chief economists and are putting out a lot of really interesting research on real estate. The interesting paradox that I like to think about here is if it happens to objectively be a great time to buy a home over the next 6 months, Zillow might look at the data and say, it's a great time to be a home buyer. Here's what the data shows, et cetera, right? And they put that piece out. Let's say that the data shows it's a terrible time to buy a home over the next 6 months, which is not a piece that maybe Zillow wants to put out. And again, I'm not saying that Zillow would actually do this, but you could imagine a world where Zillow says, not sure we want to publish a story that says it's a terrible time to buy a home right now. Let's squash that story. And I think that's why it is important that there are independent news outlets thinking about and able to tell that story, because I don't think we can lean on and depend on brands to independently make those choices. And so I think it's really important for consumers to understand when I'm reading a story and it's coming from a for-profit organization, what are kind of the underlying motives of that for-profit organization, and how can I read that content through that lens, read the absence of coverage through that lens. So I don't think I don't think of the best form and what we can live in, the world we can live in, is a world where all coverage is coming from organizations, but I do think that they can be a really valuable part of the overall kind of content ecosystem.
Absolutely. And it requires some media literacy on the part of the audience. Unfortunately, we don't really teach it anywhere in schools.
No.
Last question for you, Noah. No matter how good the content is, nobody's paying attention. We're second screening, we're third screening, we have a 3-second attention. How do we get people's attention with great content?
That's the $1 million question. Outside of hiring Ryan Reynolds or some other major celebrity, I think that, copywriting and the skills associated with copywriting is really an underrated and lost art. That, 10% of content is breaking through to consumers. Whether you're creating a TikTok video, whether you're writing an article, it's about thinking about what's the hook? How am I really positioning the headline, the coverage, telling something unique? How am I making this content applicable to the reader? We've seen that some of the hundreds of stories we syndicate on the Stacker Wire every month, we do a lot of analytics on what type of content is performing, what are readers looking at, what are they not. And what we've seen is one cheat code to getting people to read your story is by comparing the city that that person lives in to other cities across the country by any form of data. It could be home prices, it could be what groceries people bought, it could be the price of groceries, it could be some survey results that you did, but people want to know how, their life looks in context of other folks and other places they can compare themselves to. One of many cheat codes that we found, but I think there's just these hooks that you can find to really grab people in. And while people do have 3-second attention spans, the top 10% of content is always going to break through. And I think it's up to PRs, advertisers, and creators in general to think about how they can do that.
Noah Greenberg, CEO Stacker. Awesome, fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for coming in today.
Really appreciate it, Guy.
All right.